Well, hello, my friend, and how are you today?
I'm doing fine. How are you, Thomas?
I'm doing great. Welcome all the glorious weirdos about to tune in. So we got a good one for you today, the Hook and Tether. We're going to be talking about the mind control of cults, what goes beyond it, what to do to get out or have somebody help you out. But first and foremost, today is June 11th, which means we are exactly 1 month away from Connecticut Paracon, www.paracon.org, right down there. Make sure you guys get your tickets, but most importantly, one of the guests that's going to be there, one of our horror guests, Ari Lehman, who was the OG first ever Jason Voorhees in the first one, where he pops up out of the water. His band, First Jason, is going to be our night event. Just cool. Make sure you get those tickets. Currently, they're at www.vololounge.com. So make sure you get those or click on our website again below. We want to get everybody out to get those pre-ticket sales. We want to do that so that way, we'll have them there at Volo, and that'll be a great concert. But the event all day is going to be fantastic. James Stokes is going to be there, of course. We'll have the OG and also the most recent Jason there, and a lot of our paranormal guests, cryptid guests, UFO, paranormal, you name it. True crime, of course, I'll be there. And so it's going to be a good time. So check out the website, see everybody coming. So it's going to be a lot of fun.
Sounds awesome.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it, but I'm also looking forward to talking about cults tonight. This is a deep dive and got a lot of information, which basically means, my friend Sean, so let's zoom in on the criminal mind. All right, my friends, I am so glad to be with you. As you see, I got a newer setup, and I just wanted to bring that to you today. I got my microphone in here, got my little notes here to read off to you so we could go into the Hook and Tether. So we're going to talk about cults, and the study of cults sits at the dark intersection of our history, social psychology, and neurology. Nobody deliberately joins a cult. Rather, they join a community with promising purpose, connection, or healing, only to find the exit doors slowly lock behind them. So what are we going to look into? So just a little brief thing into the mind, some of the history, and then we'll kind of expound on it just to do this little deep dive. But the mind control mechanics, mind control isn't a supernatural force. It is a systematic application of extreme social and psychological compliance techniques. Experts generally discard Hollywood-style hypnotic brainwashing in favor of models like Stephen Hassan's BITE model, which maps how destructive groups override an individual's autonomy. Basically, starting off with the B, behavioral control. This constitutes dictating daily routines, sleep schedules, diet, clothing, sleep, and nutritional deprivation, weakening cognitive defenses, making critical thinking difficult, which could also happen in just regular relationships. Those narcissistic relationships, power, and things like that. The I part of BITE, information control, limiting access to outside news, family members, or critical literature. Alternative viewpoints are framed as dangerous or deceptive, fake news, or satanic influence. There's also the T, thought control, using specialized buzzwords or thought-terminating cliches, short phrases that stop critical debate, like just have faith, or that's your ego talking. This forces a binary us versus them worldview. And finally, emotional control, manipulating guilt, fear, and dependency. This often begins with love bombing, showering a new recruit with overwhelming affection and validation, followed by a sudden threat of shunning or cosmic punishment if they step out of line. So historically, the changing faces of cults, we look at the history of it. The modern concept of a cult, of course, evolved through distinct cultural eras, shifting from theological panics to geopolitical fears, and today to algorithmic echo chambers, especially through our websites and what we tune into. The rise of charismatic communes, 1960s and 70s, amid civil rights unrest and anti-war counterculture, seekers flocked to alternative movements. Groups like the People's Temple, Jim Jones, blended progressive social ideals with deadly paranoid isolationism, culminating in the 1978 Jonestown tragedy with over 900 people died. We'll talk more about that. The Satanic Panic, an anti-cultural cult movement, 80s and 90s, a wave of moral panic swept the U.S. with widespread media-fueled fears of underground occult rings. Concurrently, highly armed doomsday cults emerged, leading to high-profile fatal standoffs like the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas, which we'll be talking about, and of course the mass suicide of Heaven's Gate. We'll be talking about that also. But there's also the commercial and self-help co-optation, 2000 to 2010s. Cult dynamics migrated into multi-level marketing, which we refer to as MLMs, and executive coaching. NXtVM, led by Keith Rainier, disguised an abusive, blackmail-driven inner circle as a high-end corporate leadership seminar for wealthy and influential. Then there's the decentralized digital cult. 2020 to present, physical compounds have largely been replaced by internet forums trying to pull you in. Modern cultic movements like QAnon or radicalized online wellness conspiracy groups operating without a central physical location, utilizing social media algorithms to self-radicalize vulnerable individuals. So they're pulling you in on the computer now. So, and instead of the person to person that they used to do, but psychological effects on an individual. So that leaving a cult is not the end of the trauma. So if these people do end up leaving the cults, the psychological scars frequently resemble those of severe domestic abuse. Again, a lot of what we're talking about is sometimes what men and women will do to each other in a relationship, and also what could happen to somebody in a hostage situation. So a lot of those domestic and the hostage situation we talked about kind of in some of our last few episodes. So it all kind of intertwines in how the mind is controlled in all those aspects. But cognitive dissonance is the mental anguish of holding two conflicting beliefs. Members rationalize away oblivious lies or failed doomsday prophecies because admitting the truth is too painful. So they're just ruled in and they're too embarrassed to leave and all that. So that's where that comes in. They have identity stripping and snapping. The cult systematically replaces the individual's pre-cult identity with a rigid cult persona. When a person leaves, they often experience profound loss of self. Post-cult trauma, complex PTSD. Survivors frequently suffer from severe anxiety, paranoia, panic attacks, and floating, suddenly slipping back into the cult-like altered mental state when triggered. So there's also social depersonalization, because cults require cutting ties with outsiders, and ex-members who leave or are excommunicated typically lose their entire social network, housing, and livelihood overnight. So there's a vulnerability myth. Psychologists stress that there is no specific cult personality type. Most people join during transitional periods of high stress, such as a divorce, moving to a new city, graduating college, or losing a loved one, when their natural human need for community and certainty is highest. So they get you when you're down. So now let's really get into a little bit more the hook and actually the tether, what they do to recruit you, and the brainwashing and the things that they do. The psychology of cult recruitment is rarely about brainwashing in the cinematic sense. Instead, it is a sophisticated, phased process of social influence that exploits universal human needs for belonging, purpose, and certainty. Most people are targeted during transitional periods like we talked about, times of grief, job loss, relocation, when their psychological defenses are naturally lower. They kick you when you're down. That's kind of what they're doing. And how they do this is probably number one, the hook we talked about, and love bombing. Recruiters don't lead with their strangest beliefs. They lead with the radical acceptance. Love bombing is the initial stage where the target is showered with excessive affection, flattery, and attention. It creates an intense high and a sense of instant community. They know what your target is. It's almost like in sales. They're trying to find out, what drives you, and so they actually flatter you to try and break down that level and get you to talk a little bit more. But mirroring, recruiters often reflect the target's own interest or values back at them, making the target feel uniquely understood. I used to feel exactly the same way until I found this group. So that's kind of what they start doing. If you ever hear that, time to run the other way. But the lure of selective disclosure, cults operate on a need-to-know basis. They use a technique called grandulism. The group often presents itself as a self-help seminar, a yoga retreat, or a political activist group. The milieu of control, once the target is interested, the group begins to control the information they receive. Outside news, family, and skeptical friends are framed as toxic or uninformed. So the thought reform, or the Lifton model, psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton identified 8 criteria for thought reform. So 2 of those that are the most effective lures used during the recruitment are loading the language, using thought-terminating cliches, short, catchy phrases that discourage critical thinking, don't analyze, just feel, or things like that. The sacred science, the group's ideology is presented as the absolute truth, which is beyond question. This offers a seductive sense of certainty in an uncertain world. The sunk cost trap, that's a big one. As the luring process moves toward full induction, the group begins to demand small sacrifices, time, small donations, or distance from negative people. That's where the cognitive dissonance comes in. Once a person has invested significant time or money, it becomes psychologically painful to admit that they were wrong. So to avoid this pain, they double down in their commitment to the group. So there's the part of the indicators for a predatory group, kind of those red flags, and almost like you're stuck there. And these are almost like sometimes sales traits too. So it's just the crazy world we live in and how we try and get the mind to move or control. So there's urgency. This is the window of opportunity is closing. You must decide now. Isolation, encouraging you to keep your involvement secret from loved ones. Elitism, telling you that you are part of an enlightened few who truly understand. And then the guilt and the shame, using personal confessions to later manipulate or blackmail the individual. So that's kind of it in a synopsis. But there's also, we're looking at that as the bones. So we're going to get into some of the famous cult groups and what they did with their followers and how they had them follow. First, let's jump into one of the more recent ones in '97. That's the Heaven's Gate cult, and it remains one of the most chilling examples of how a destructive group can use sophisticated psychological manipulation and total behavioral control to lead its members to a tragic end. Founded in the 1970s by Marshall Applewhite, who went by Doe, and Bonnie Nettles, who went by T, the group culminated in the mass suicide of 39 members in March of 1997. Their control was not maintained through physical force, but through systematic, high-demanding psychological architecture. So first off, the theological and psychological hook that they had was the group's ideology was a unique fusion of Christian radical transformation, which is basically the belief in a major turning point in science fiction and UFO mythology. The core belief, members believed their bodies were mere vehicles or containers. The ultimate goal was to shed these earthly vessels to ascend to the evolutionary level above human, Tela, entering a physical kingdom in space. The cognitive shift they had was by framing the human body as disposable and the earth as a planet about to be recycled. Applewhite systematically decoupled members from their basic survival instincts. Death was completely redefined, not as an end, but as a graduation. Then they had that total environmental and behavior control. Heaven's Gate utilized extreme methods of social isolation and behavioral uniformity to reshape reality for members. Isolation from former lives. Upon joining, members were required to cut off all ties and family, friends, and outside world. They eliminated external feedback loops and might challenge the cult's logic. Erasure of individuality to diminish the human ego. Members wore identical unisex clothing, adopted uniform crew cuts, and gave up their legal names for new multi-syllabic names. The check partner system they used was members were paired up in a buddy system. They were never supposed to be alone, serving as constant mutual monitors of each other's behavior and thoughts. This created a self-policing environment where the privacy was entirely eradicated. And the rigid scheduling every day with a micromanage in 12-minute increments, the intense structure kept members in a state of perpetual focus on group tasks, leaving zero mental downtime for critical reflection or doubt. Cognitive and emotional manipulation. Applewhite and Nettles established an absolute hierarchy based on complete submission. The concept of major offenses. The group operated under strict rules where independent thinking was pathologized. Deceit, holding on to a private opinion, or defending oneself were labeled as major spiritual regressions. Suppression of biological drives. Abstinence from pleasure was strictly enforced to completely eliminate sexual desire and further distance themselves from human nature. Several male members, including Applewhite himself, underwent surgical castration. Oh, that's crazy. So the illusion of autonomy. Crucially, Applewhite frequently offered members the chance to leave, telling them they were free to go if they weren't ready. Psychologically, this clever tactic reinforced the illusion of free will because they chose to stay every time their commitment to the group's final objective often deepened. So the final catalyst for them was the Hale-Bopp comet, which we all heard of. The ultimate test of control came with the appearance of the Hale-Bopp comet in 1997. The group became convinced that the spacecraft was hiding in the shadow of the comet, waiting to take them to the next level. Because of their psychological conditioning had completely severed their identification with their human identities, the final instruction to shed their containers was met not with panic, but with calm, systematic compliance. They packed luggage, carried $5 bills for interplanetary tolls, and took a lethal mixture of phenobarbital and vodka in organized shifts, completely consumed by the psychological reality carefully constructed around them over 2 decades. Woo, that was a crazy one. And, you know, we look at this as normal people and what we consider normal. I know we're all glorious weirdos, but the fact that somebody believed in that, we look at it as crazy, just the way the mind works. We don't know how it works and how it becomes prisoner that way. And it's incredible that so many people just feel a need to belong, and there's other people that feel the need to control those people, and that's what we run into. But the next one I want to talk about is the Branch Davidians, David Koresh. You know, David Koresh did not rely on sci-fi style mind control or hypnotic trances to dominate the Branch Davidians. Instead, he used a highly sophisticated combination of psychological manipulation, spiritual coercion, and systematic isolation. So we're seeing a theme here with a lot of these cults that we talked about. There are, you know, some differences, but all in all, it all comes back to the same steps of mind control and how to get this cult-like atmosphere. But me, as a behaviorist and profiler, I would observe that Koresh exploited the fundamental human needs for belonging, purpose, and certainty, gradually stripping away his followers' autonomy until his will entirely replaced their own. Let's do a breakdown of the primary mechanism Koresh used to establish absolute psychological control. Scriptural monopoly and spiritual gaslighting. Koresh's authority was entirely built on his claim to be the ultimate prophet who would alone could unlock the 7 seals of the book of Revelation. He's the living word. He convinced his followers that salvation was impossible without him. If a follower doubted Koresh, they weren't just doubting a man, they were defying God and risking eternal damnation. exhaustive studies. He would subject followers to marathon 15-hour Bible study sessions. This served a dual purpose. It deeply ingrained his skewed theology while physically and mentally exhausting the group, breaking down their critical thinking skills. So systematic isolation and information control that he went through to his people to control what they were thinking. You must control what they hear and see. Koresh gradually severed his followers' ties to the outside world. Physical segregation. He moved the group to the Mount Carmel Center near Waco, Texas, which we're all familiar with when it was burning down. Physically removed them from the mainstream society, family support systems, and dissenting viewpoints. The us versus them mentality, which we talked about. He framed the outside world, especially the U.S. government, as Babylon, an evil entity destined to attack them. This created a hyper-vigilant, paranoid environment where followers felt safe only inside the compound under his protection. So the destruction of the family unit. So Koresh systematically dismantled the traditional family structures within the compound to ensure that all loyalty, love, and devotion flowed exclusively to him. The New Light doctrine in 89, Koresh declared that God had commanded him to create a new lineage of God's children. He dissolved all marriages within the group, declaring that only he had the right to bear children with the women, including minors. Emasculation and submission. The men were forced to celibacy and had to watch their wives and daughters become Koresh's spiritual wives. By forcing the men to accept this profound humiliation, he effectively broke their egos and secured absolute psychological submission. So he also did sleep deprivation on them, dietary control. So the psychological control is significantly easier to maintain when the physical body is weakened. So disrupting sleep, Koresh frequently called mandatory meetings or Bible studies in the middle of the night. Persistent sleep deprivation keeps the brain in a fog, making it incredibly difficult to process complex thoughts, question anomalies, or plan an escape. He rationed the regimes. The diet of Mount Carmel was heavily controlled, often sparse and strictly dictated by Koresh, reinforcing the reality that he was the literal provider of their survival. And he weaponized vulnerability. Koresh was a master of reading people. He targeted individuals who were looking for deeper meaning, going through life transitions, or feeling alienated by mainstream religion. He initially showered new recruits with affection and validation, a tactic known as love bombing. That one keeps coming up, making them feel profoundly chosen and special before slowly introducing strict, more abusive demands. My take as a profiler with David Koresh, he didn't force people to stay at Mount Carmel with physical chains. I think he actually built a psychological cage out of their own faith, fear, and desire for salvation. But by the time 1993 siege began, the outer world was so demonized and Koresh was so deeply internalized as their Messiah that most followers generally believed dying with him was preferable to living in quote unquote Babylon. Whew. I tell you, those first two are crazy, but it just gets crazier after this. So, probably one of the most known cults that people have been studying for years and taking a look at it, and media and politicians got involved, was the Jim Jones People's Temple. The control of Jim Jones exerted over the members of the People's Temple was not the result of a single event, but rather a masterclass in gradual, systematic psychological manipulation. Long before the tragic events of November 18th, 1978 in Jonestown, Guyana, Jones built a sophisticated apparatus of control using established behavioral principles, isolation, and exploitation of his followers' highest ideals. So here's the breakdown of the primary mechanism Jones used to control his people. Exploitation of ideals and gradual commitment. Jones did not attract followers by preaching death. He attracted them by preaching racial equality, integration, socialist ideals, in a deeply supportive community during a time of intense civil rights struggle and political delusionment with America. Once people joined, he used foot in the door tactics. What are these, you say? Small requests escalating to large sacrifices. It began with attending weekly meetings, moved to donating a percentage of income, progressed to turning over all personal assets, and ultimately ending in communal living where the temple controlled every aspect of daily life. We go back to the sunk cost fallacy. By the time members realized how extreme the group had become, they had already given up their homes, savings, careers, making the psychological cost of leaving feel too high to bear. Then they went to systematic isolation. Control requires the elimination of competing viewpoints. Jones systematically severed his follower ties to the outside world to ensure that he was the sole source of truth and authority. Geographic isolation. So he really didn't just put him in a commune like nearby. He went totally out of country. So he moved from Indiana to California, ultimately to the remote jungle of Guyana, Jonestown, physically cut members off from family, alternative information, and any hope of a quick escape. Social isolation. Members were encouraged to view non-temple family members as enemies of the cause or racists who would corrupt them. Destruction of the nuclear family, very similar to what Koresh did with Jonestown. Jones actively disrupted marriages and parental bonds. Couples were forced to separate and children were raised communally, or loyalties were redirected entirely towards Jones, whom everyone was required to call father or dad. So the total information control and cognitive fatigue. In Jonestown, there was no independent news sources, telephones, or unsanctioned radios. There was continuous propaganda. Jones' voice was broadcast over loudspeakers across the pavilion 24 hours a day, reading heavily altered news reports or delivering hours-long lectures, even while members slept. His voice permeated the environment. Sleep deprivation and exhaustion. Members worked 10 to 12 hours a day in harsh tropical conditions on a low-protein diet consisting mostly of rice and beans. A physically and mentally exhausted brain lacks the cognitive energy required to critically analyze propaganda, question authority, or plan an escape. Some of these cult leaders were so afraid people were going to take off on them and leave. It's that battle. It's just sheer narcissism and just utter craziness that a lot of these people went through. But I think talking about this really teaches the mind and what comes at the mind and how to push these things away and recognize them as everything progresses with more and more back then up to the digital age now, and what we're reading and what's true, what's not true. What are they trying to psyop our brains or anything like that? But back to Jim Jones, his coercion, informant culture, and fear. Jones created a high surveillance environment where trust among followers was entirely broken down. The informant network, members were required to report on one another, even children, against their parents for any signs of dissonance, laziness, or desire to leave. This meant that no one knew who was safe to talk to, effectively eliminating internal resistance. Public humiliation in catharsis sessions. Dissenters or those accused of breaking rules were subjected to public trials during community meetings. They were forced to confess to fabricate or minor infractions, followed by severe public verbal berating or physical beatings to break their individual will. The external threat narrative. Jones maintained control of manufacturing a constant state of siege. He convinced his followers that the U.S. government, the CIA, and racist forces were actively plotting to destroy the commune, torture them, and place their children in concentration camps. This made compliance look like a matter of survival. So de-individualization and suicide rehearsals. Through a process of de-individuation, members lost their personal identities and became entirely absorbed in the collective identity of the temple. White Nights was months before the final tragedy. Jones instituted White Nights. Emergency alerts triggered by loudspeakers in the middle of the night. Members would line up, receive a cup of liquid, and be told it was poison to test their loyalty. After they drank it and hours passed, Jones would reveal it was just a test. By rehearsing the act of mass suicide, Multiple times under extreme duress, Jones successfully conditioned his followers. When the final night arrived, the psychological barrier to drinking the lethal mixture had already been systematically dismantled. Ultimately, Jim Jones did not control his people through physical chains, but by capturing their ideals, fatiguing their bodies, breaking down their familiar bonds, and rewriting their reality through fear. Wow. So those are three that we just talked about, more of the popular ones that we've all heard of, but ultimately more of the cultural one in how he did things. And a lot of people think that where a lot of his stuff comes because he was in and out of prison so much, and possibly a connection of drug-induced MK Ultra getting to this guy was Charles Manson. So he didn't control his followers through physical force or obvious threats. Instead, he used a highly sophisticated, calculated combination of psychological conditioning, isolation, exploitation of the late 1960s counterculture. As a career criminal, he spent over half of his life in correctional institutions. Manson had expertly studied human behavior, manipulation tactics, and how to exploit vulnerability. So let's look at the breakdown of the primary psychological mechanics Manson used to build and control the family. So he targeting and exploiting vulnerability. Manson rarely targeted stable individuals. He sought out young, middle-class runaways, dropouts, and societal outcasts, predominantly young women who were drifting through California. Many were estranged from their families, deeply insecure and searching for a sense of purpose or belonging. Manson offered them an immediate, unconditional family structure, filling their emotional voids, so they became intensely loyal to him. In the systematic isolation to break down his followers' old identities, Manson physically and socially isolated them. He moved the group to the remote locations, most notably Spahn Ranch, a dilapidated, isolated movie set in the Los Angeles hills, by cutting off contact with worried parents, old friends. In mainstream society, he ensured that the group has no reality checks. He became their sole source of information, validation, and truth. His deconstruction of ego and identity. Once he isolated, Manson used deliberate techniques to strip away his followers' previous societal conditioning, a process similar to traditional brainwashing. The surrender of assets, followers were required to give up their money, identification, and personal belongings to the group, making them entirely dependent on Manson for survival. Stripping their past, he frequently gave his followers new names to signify the death of their old lives. So he would do sleep and nutritional deprivation. That seems to be a big thing with all the cults that we just mentioned. So the family kept erratic hours, often sleeping during the day and staying awake all night listening to Manson preach. Combined with a meager diet and intense physical labor around the ranch, this constant fatigue broke down their cognitive defenses and critical thinking skills. Weaponizing psychedelics and group rituals. Manson heavily utilizes the counterculture's acceptance of hallucinogens, specifically LSD. However, while his followers were tripping, Manson would often take a significantly smaller dose or fake taking it entirely. This allowed him to remain completely sober and hyper-aware while his followers were in highly suggestible altered states of consciousness. He used these trips to guide their thoughts, conduct intense group confessions, and reprogram their morals, effectively rewriting their boundaries of right and wrong. And then the Masonic projection of scriptural manipulation. Manson masterfully blended elements of fragmented Christianity, Eastern philosophy, and his own twisted apocalyptic theories. He convinced his followers that he was Christ-like figure and occasionally a manifestation of the devil. He leveraged contemporary culture touchstones to validate his delusions, most famously twisting the lyrics in the Beatles' White Album. He convinced the family that the songs like Helter Skelter contain hidden prophetic warnings of an impending catastrophic race war. He positioned himself, and by extension them, as the elite remnants who would survive in the desert and emerge to rule what was left of the world. His exploitation and sexual dynamics. Manson used sex as a tool of compliance and dominance. He controlled who slept with whom and frequently used the women in the family as currency to appease male newcomers, ranch hands, or influential figures like Beach Boys drummer Dennis Wilson to secure resources and housing by breaking down traditional sexual taboos and turning intimacy into a communal obligation dictated by him. He destroyed traditional pairing bonds, ensuring everyone's primary devotion remained strictly tied to him. That behavioral result, thought his multi-layered conditioning, Manson created a closed ideological ecosystem. His followers didn't view his orders as external commands from a dictator. Rather, they had internalized his worldview so deeply that they believed they were acting on their own free will, ultimately leading them to commit brutal acts of violence on his behalf. Woo, those are some of the popular ones. But a lot of people, you look at that and it's like, how could somebody get involved with that? That vulnerability, that mind control, and it's so hard to really pinpoint. People get taken advantage of, and I don't care how smart you think you are, or you think that wouldn't happen to you. It can. It doesn't matter. And that's where I want to get into the next few things, because this is more of our cult-like stuff, is the modern business cults, the digital age, and what we have going on. But while we usually associate the word cult with isolated compounds or fringe religious groups, the psychological mechanics of coercive control are actively used by mainstream organizations. From high-pressure corporate environments to seemingly standard self-improvement networks, these groups recruit and retain people using the exact same playbook as cults. Here's a breakdown of the specific fields, industries, and organizational structures that frequently mimic cult-like control tactics. Talked earlier, multi-level marketing, MLM companies. While MLMs operate legally as direct sales businesses, their internal culture often relies heavily on psychological manipulation. They recruit heavily by promising financial freedom, time flexibility, and a tight-knit community. Of course, they're going to love bomb them, so that's a par for the course. So new recruits are showered with overwhelming praise, attention, validation by their upline, the people who recruited them, to create an immediate sense of belonging. The us versus them mentality. If the family members or friends express skepticism about the business model or the recruit's spending, the group labels them as unsupportive haters or negative influences and gradually isolate the recruit from their outside support system. So commercialized exploitation success is entirely tied to obedience to the system in the constant recruiting. When a distributor fails to make money, as they vast majority do, the blame is placed entirely on their lack of mindset, effort, or belief, never on the flawed structure of the business itself. So that's quite a few of those types of groups out there. I'll leave it up to your interpretation. I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, but business-wise, there's plenty of them out there, quite a few. There's other ones. There are high control large group awareness trainings, or LGATs. These are commercial seminars, or multi-day workshops that promise radical self-improvement, professional breakthroughs, or emotional healing. The milieu of control programs often involve grueling 12 to 15-hour days in windowless rooms with strict rules against taking notes, leaving the room, or speaking out of turn. The physical and mental exhaustion lowers cognitive defenses. The public confession and stripping of identity. Participants are encouraged to share their deepest traumas, secrets, or failures in front of a large audience. The facilitators then deconstruct the person's ego, leaving them emotionally raw before rebuilding their identity around the organization's proprietary philosophy. So you have the endless ladder. The introductory weekend is designed to create a massive emotional high. To maintain that high, participants are immediately pressured to buy expensive advanced tiers, volunteer their time to staff future events, and aggressively recruit their loved ones. That happens a lot. You think you're going to get something and the success there, and it's just so defeating sometimes that, they take somebody's desperation, and unfortunately it happens so much in our world, and it just leaves people just penniless and all, and it's sickening. But we have to start learning, and I'm glad I'm able to talk about this type of stuff on the show, because hopefully you'll hear something that, you're involved in something right now that it'll trigger something where you can make your exit before they get that hook and tether into you. But the high demand corporate and tech environments, certain highly intense corporate cultures often seen in booming tech startups, aggressive financial firms, or hyper niche consultancies can cross the line from hard work into coercive control. So total devotion, the company positions itself not just as a workplace, but has a grand mission to change the world. Employees are expected to adopt the company's jargon, values, and lifestyle completely. They enforce enclosure by providing every single life necessity on campus: gourmet meals, gyms, dry cleaning, sleep pods, and social events. The company subtly cuts off the employee's need for an outside life, making their entire social circle dependent on the workplace. Sounds like some big companies. I won't name too many, Google. But fear-based compliance under the guise of radical transparency or performance metrics. Employees are subjected to constant peer reviews and public callouts, keeping them in perpetual state of anxiety and hyper performance. There's a lot of those companies out there, the new wave and those types of things, and taking advantage of young people and just people whose minds just have a need and to belong. And next thing you know, it's just everything gets out of control. But another thing is there's a lot of these facilities for troubled teen industries. This includes certain unregulated wilderness therapy programs, behavior modification boarding schools, and boot camps designed for rebellious or struggling youth. Total deconstruction. Upon arrival, youth are stripped of all personal belongings, communication devices. In contact with their parents, they are often given uniform clothing and a new set of rigid rules. Surveillance and informant culture. Every action is monitored, and minors are frequently rewarded with points or privileges for reporting the infractions of their peers, destroying solidarity and creating an environment of total distrust. Gaslighting as therapy. Natural emotional responses to confinement or isolation, like anger, crying, or withdrawal, are pathologized. I can't even speak today. Pathologized as further evidence of the youth's mental instability or behavioral defiance, forcing complete submission to the staff's authority. The core psychological mechanics across all these groups. The control relies on three primary phases, famously outlined by social psychologist Kurt Lewin, who refined by cult experts. So a lot of these core mechanics here is the unfreezing, breaking down a person's current defense mechanisms, beliefs, and confidence through exhaustion, isolation, or love bombing. The changing part, introduction of the group's new worldview, language, and behavior patterns as only the path to safety, success, or enlightenment. And refreezing, locking the new identity in place by punishing, rewarding compliance, and making the cost of leaving feel entirely catastrophic to the person's social or financial life. So we're hearing a lot of the same things in all these, your regular religious cults, end of the world cults, these businesses and all that, but especially the business, though the big one that was in the news just at the beginning in the 2010s was Keith Raniere, the Nexium, marketing itself as a high-end multi-level marketing company offering executive success programs to wealthy professionals, actors, and elites. So there's a lot of big names that joined this. There was the woman from Smallville that really got enthralled in this, that made a lot of history, and there was a lot of arrest with this. But the recruitment part of it was they drew people in through professional development and self-help workshops, promising to unlock human potential and conquer personal anxieties. So the control part of it was Raniere used collateral, forcing members to hand over deeply damaging secrets, naked photos, or financial assets before entering inner circles. The blackmail paired with intense sleep deprivation. There's the sleep deprivation again. So I don't know, if somebody's telling you not to go to sleep, and you know you're in the wrong situation. And the psychological gaslighting kept members trapped in a secret sexual and abusive subgroup called DOS. Oof. That's a lot of mind control, a lot of things I'm throwing at you guys. I know I'm breezing through this because a lot of information to get through. I know we're getting less for time, but you know, I want to kind of end it here, coming up with how to help somebody out of a cult. After people go through all this stuff, the mind control to go in, and now it's the deprogram or getting them back to hopefully some kind of normal. So helping someone leave a high control group, often called, of course, the cult, is a delicate process that requires patience, emotional regulation, and a non-confrontational approach. The goal is not to argue them out of their beliefs, but to believe them, reconnect with their own critical thinking and pre-cult identity. First off, probably feed them and let them get some sleep. Tell them to keep some money in their pocket. I know right there, but that's too easy, I guess. But the core principles of communication, the most important rule is to avoid direct attacks on the group or its leader. When a member feels their new identity is under attack, they often retreat further into the group's doctrine, the backfire effect. So we don't want that to happen. We got to be very on the fence in how we deal with these people, why they're in, or if they want to get out, and how to help with that. But you got to be a safe harbor. You got to maintain a consistent, warm, and non-judgmental connection. They need to know that if you ever decide to leave, you will be there without saying, "I told you so." You got to focus on the authentic self. Remind them of who they were before the group. Talk about old hobbies, shared memories, or music they used to love. This helps bridge the gap between their current cult persona and their original identity. So you want to ask philosophical questions instead of telling them the group is wrong. Ask them open-ended questions that require them to think through contradictions. For example, how do you personally feel when so-and-so or something happens? Or what would happen if you disagreed with a specific rule? So it's getting them to think. It's like, okay, what's going to happen? How far in are they, and what they know, and where they're at, and how to bridge that gap and rewind everything. It's just so difficult. But there is the tactical steps for support. So you want to, of course, build an emotional bridge foundationally. Establish regular low-pressure contact. That was nothing to do with the cult. Discuss family, sports, or neutral memories to reinforce their identity outside the group's influence. It's almost similar when somebody with Alzheimer's, you just go with it and you just talk about general stuff, and you don't tell them what to do or those types of things, that they should think this, they should think that. It's almost the same when somebody loses a loved one. You just have to be by their side and listen, and just talk about the weather or sports or anything like that. It really is. It just shows that there's another world out there, and they have to know that people love them and they do belong and stuff, and they don't have to belong to a group that wants to whatever end the world, or weird religious ideology. But again, to each their own. Crazies out there. But we want to look at the model of critical thinking, indirect influence. Instead of criticizing the group, talk other historical groups or psychological concepts like groupthink or cognitive dissonance in a neutral context. This allows them to recognize patterns without feeling personally attacked. So you want to identify, of course, the cracks. Most members have a self items, doubts, or observations they have to put on the shelf to deal with later. Listen to these small complaints or inconsistencies and gently validate their feelings without pushing for total exit immediately. So you want to prepare an exit strategy for them. Of course, safety first. If they express a desire to leave, have a plan ready. This includes physical safety, a place to stay, and potentially deprogramming resources or specialized therapy to handle the sudden loss of their social structure. So that's almost it in a nutshell. But there's so much information. I always encourage people to go check up on some of these. If there is something that you heard that sounds familiar in your own life, because this isn't only cults. Sometimes this is your personal relationships, whether it be the woman in your life, the man in your life, just where you work, those types of things, you really have to look in the mirror and ask yourself, what's going on, and is this good for me, and should I walk away, and not try and get too deep in it. And if you are too deep in it, hopefully you could find that support to get out of there, and hopefully you recognize that before it's like too late where you lose everything, unfortunately. But some of the red flags, of course, to watch out for: cults come in many flavors: political, commercial, therapeutic, religious. If the group uses these specific psychological uncluttering blocks, you may need professional intervention or run like hell. So if they have a charismatic leader, an authoritarian figure who is unaccountable, revered as a god or guru, or claims to have exclusive access to the truth. No allowed dissonant. Questions are turned back on the questioner as proof of their own flaws, ego, or low vibration. Us versus them mentality. The world outside the group is painted as corrupt, dangerous, or doomed, making the act of leaving feel like spiritual or physical death. Thought terminating cliches, of course, short, repetitive phrases used to stop critical thought. Just trust the process, or the mind is the enemy. So all those types of little cliche words that they all make up in a lot of these groups to follow by, and that mantra. So information control, if they're restricting access to outside news, family, or the internet. And then, of course, the loaded language using insider jargon that makes it difficult for the member to communicate with the outside world. They give you certain words and people don't understand what you're talking about. And so, yeah, there's just so much wrong there. So, but remember, forcible deprogramming is largely considered outdated and counterproductive. Modern exit counseling focuses on voluntary education and empowering the individual to make their own choices to leave. So a lot of this, when you need that guidance and things like that, I'll bring it up again, and I always bring this up with our global group, Wardruna, and the Healing Collective. We do have people in our group that are able to work you through this with our psychologists, our certified practitioners, and all that. So if you ever need help, just reach out. We're here to help you, especially in these situations and anything like that. Remember, we're always there for you. But, I want to take this time, maybe if you guys have any questions, of course, let's answer those. Sean, if you're still out there, bring you back on, and let's kind of wrap this.
I'm still here. Actually, the weather's cleared up, so I think we're in the clear. So.
Oh, that's good. We didn't get struck by lightning after talking about religious cults, right?
No, I'm afraid not. We're in the clear for sure.
Yeah, we just have to make sure we sleep and we eat right, and we don't let the people control our minds. I think we'll be okay.
You had quite a few watchers tonight, but the ones that made a few comments here was Miss Stacy Wells from Wardruna, and you've had Adam Bing, says the man, and Mr. Greg Goss.
So Greg's, I've been on his show a couple times. Of course, Adam Began, I actually helping him out this year with his show by donating. And of course, Wardruna Stacia Wills is my better half. So It's good to have them on. So big parts of my life, especially Stacia, and Adam's been a big part of my life, and Greg. And I'm glad they're able to hear what we talked about tonight. And anybody out there that we heard what we talked about, it's important, because as we go through all this, you really see it doesn't matter. Everybody says, I'll never, get into a religious cult or anything like that. But this is what I wanted to talk about at the end. So something very personal to me. We all know when we grow up and we're young, we fall head over heels in love with a girl.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and we're enamored with it. And it's almost the same like control thing is you meet somebody you really love and you'll do anything for them. Now, years and years and years ago, I met a girl, and, she had a weird name. And I never was like, where'd you get that name from? So little by little, it was chipping away. Her family and all that. I met her family, and they always had this weird picture of this guy in, the picture. They go, who's that? And they go, oh, that's, they kind of avoided it at first, and they started telling me. But come to find out, and you guys could all look this up, it was in Connecticut, in that area, and the group was led by this guru guy who claimed that he was the second coming of Christ. His name was Julius Shacknow, and the name of the cult was The Work. And these people built up all the assets they collected from their followers, and they built a real estate business that got pretty heavy duty with all the people working for nothing. So this Julius Shacknow pretty much controlled everything, and he had his wife for the time, and she was considered the Holy Spirit. So they really had this inner workings of this type of stuff. And Julius had a son, Dan, and there was also Paul, who is now, after Julius left his wife there, considered the Holy Spirit. Paul marries her, and he's considered like the head apostle. So there's this whole inner workings. Everybody got different names. So everything we talked about is really what they were doing. Really, there wasn't really sleep deprivation or anything like that, but there was like really a lot of Bible study and all that. So I'm really, enamored with this girl. So it's almost like 1 foot in and 1 foot out, because I knew something was weird there, but it's like I wanted to be with her, and I wanted to, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? It was always a constant struggle in my brain. And but I saw the inner workings of how this thing was all working, and talking about tonight really brought that back, and I thought I'd bring it up. But I talk about serial killers a lot and murderers and things like that.
Yeah.
This is where it gets crazy. So all that time, when I left this group, because the girl basically was like either you're part of the group or you can't be with her anymore. So I guess I couldn't be with her anymore. So I came to my senses. The hard part is like afterwards, I know a few years later, this guru ends up passing away, and then this Paul and all them, Holy Spirit, her name, I think it was Joanne or something like that, they take over, and there wasn't the same control, and some people got upset. And this Paul was lured to an area, and two of these members killed him, chopped him up in pieces, and he was found near a golf course. And they were finally caught, these two people that killed him. But it's so crazy. And there's been books written about this cult, and it was called The Work. Julius Shacknow in Connecticut. Look it up. It is quite a crazy history. It's another one of those cults, but may not people have heard about enough. But the other ones I mentioned, a lot of people heard about. But there's so many of them out there. There's so many people transitioning, going through things in life, and there's people out there ready to take advantage of you and take all your money and take your autonomy. Yeah.
Very, very good manipulators, very good, how do I say, sweet talkers when it comes to relationships, promising things that, they can't do or follow through with, and, keep begging for other chances and just keep pushing the envelope until there's no more.
Yeah. And it is, I know this is cults, but like we've talked about, Sean, this is individual people too. This is how people control their spouses and things like that. The same type of tactics in a way, keeping things from them and only giving them so much, and the constant manipulation and the gaslighting and all that. It's a normal, I hate to say a normal thing, but it's out there. It's a matter of, hopefully I'm giving you information to recognize it. Can I tell you how to get out of it? No, I don't. I don't know your mind. I don't know what your weaknesses are. And somebody able to see those weaknesses, you have to have that self-control, be able to look in the mirror, know who you are, put up those boundaries, the healthy boundaries, get that help, and recognize the red flags that we talked about right away, so you don't get into that situation. I'm not going to say all religions are bad or anything like that. You just have to be careful. You got to know what you really want and know what's going to make you happy. So it's always our pursuit of happiness. It's to keep the roof over our head and all that. Don't let somebody take that roof away from you because of some weakness or something. Always have that internal strength and that fortitude to go forward. Because a lot of times when things are bad, we could look back on 5 years ago, 5 years from now, and find out it wasn't really that bad. We just have to stick with it, have positive, have that family around you. Don't look at family for some other things and all that. So we don't want that to happen.
Right.
Was your tornado warning?
No, I thought I actually had my volume down, but it must have came back up because my phone updated yesterday from US Cellular to T-Mobile, and everything's like totally different now.
Yeah, I hate when they do that. So it's like all these updates and things. It's like, no, I got to go on a show. I can't update my computer now. What the hell?
Especially right before it happens, and they, oh, you got to do this. No, can't.
Yeah, exactly.
But you were definitely right. You know, we even on my show there last Sunday, we kind of talked about the relationship part just on one-on-one stuff. And tonight you actually dug into the occult side of it and how things are manipulated. And yeah. For sure.
Yeah, it's a constant. They're constantly, when you're trying to heal yourself, there's constantly somebody else trying to get one over on you. It's that battle of good and evil. There is a them versus us, but it's more of your internal that you have to struggle with. You know, who you are. Only you can control who you are. You can't let anybody else control who you are and take over your whole autonomy or anything like that. It's just not healthy either way. Even if you think it's a good thing, it's still not healthy to give up your whole control of you. When you're in a relationship, it's got to be that bond where you help the other out, and it's a team thing. It's not a one over the other, because that's when it becomes unhealthy and toxic.
And definitely be able to have that communication between the two of you of what you need out of the relationship, and be able to work together, like you said, in order to make it work, instead of just sitting there fighting, argue, manipulating, twisting things. You know, arguing and fighting doesn't solve anything. I mean, it's just like talking to the wall sometimes. And some people still don't get it, even if you do argue and fight with them. But once you get that communication skill and be able to sit there and communicate with them, and you start that bonding, like you said, things could be so much easier.
It is. It's a matter of, there's people have their egos are too big. Sometimes you have to admit you're wrong. I'm one of those people. If I'm wrong, I'll tell you I'm wrong. But then again, the other part of me is, if I'm right, I'll fight you. So I argue the point, because I will. If I'm arguing with you, is because I know fact and backup that I'm right. If I'm not really arguing, if I'm being quiet and all that, it's like, now I'm learning and I'm letting you know I'm wrong, and I want to know what I did wrong and how to make that better. And that's
exactly. Exactly. I definitely agree on that 100% as well. And I do the same exact thing as well.
Yeah. It's healthy. You know, people argue, but it's healthy when it's open and you respect each other and each other's opinion. And sometimes you have to voice what's not working, but it's a matter of keeping an open mind and hearing what's not going wrong, what's going wrong, and then suggestions on how to fix it. You can't argue and not have a solution.
Right.
So all you're is going to go around in circle, and it just becomes toxic.
Exactly.
You have to come with a solution.
It just gets worse. And like I said, then you're both miserable, and then you're both mentally not in the right frame of mind all the time. And then you keep digging down the hole.
Yeah. Or you end up in these with lack of sleep and not eating and all these other cult-like things that happen sometimes just naturally, because you get so caught up when you're arguing all the time. Your body's stuck in fight or flight all the time. That's where the trauma comes in, even from stuff that gets brought up. A lot of people argue because of past traumas. It's a trigger, and they argue. They don't know where it's coming from, and we got to unwind that. And I'm glad, you know, like I mentioned before, the group Wardruna and what we do to help people with that ancestral ties and those things that keep coming up over and over again. So we'll be talking all over the country this year about Wardruna. So you'll probably see us in one of these cities, states, whatever. So make come and hear us talk. But again, also remember, 1 month from now, we'll have the Connecticut Paracon, July 11th in North Haven, Connecticut. Again, right down there is the website. So make sure you check that out. Get your tickets ahead of time. Again, for First Jason, the first Jason Voorhees' band's going to be playing, the OG himself. So make sure you get tickets for that. But other than that, Sean, I'm ready. And next week, pending, we're going to be going over the mind control and the things that are thrown out by politicians to get votes.
There you go. That ought to get really deep.
Jumping in and figuring out how people do what and the psyops they do to mess with our minds to get them to vote our way or to forget about something negative they did in the old spin doctor kind of stuff that controls them.
Most definitely. That does sound interesting for sure. And like I said, you give out a bunch of great information and, keep up the great work, man.
I appreciate that, my friend. But to all you guys out there, we're at the end of the show. And like I always say, down a rabbit hole again.
Have a nice night, guys.